Hey you! Welcome back to Secrets with Maeve, the space for the conversations we usually keep to ourselves. I'm Maeve. Today, we're talking about something I know so many of us struggle with in silence. If she acts like this, she's obsessed with you. Let's get into it. You think she doesn't like you? You think she's not interested? You're reading the signals all wrong. I'm Sarah Johnson, host of The Female Touch. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from now? You think that distance means disinterest? You think silence means she's moved on? But what if I told you she's been thinking about you more than you realize? And here's the part that's gonna sound crazy. The colder she acts, the more obsessed she might actually be. Stay with me because this gets wild. Most men miss these signs completely. They give up right when she's starting to obsess. They walk away right when her brain is working overtime trying to figure them out. But there's the one sign men overlook, one specific sign that reveals everything. And when I tell you what it is, you're going to replay every interaction you've had with her. You're going to see patterns you completely missed. I'm going to show you the hidden signals that reveal she's thinking about you constantly, even when she acts like she doesn't care, even when she seems cold or distant, even when every surface level sign says she's not interested. And here's what nobody tells you. There's a psychological phenomenon that happens in a woman's brain when she's attracted to someone but trying to hide it. And once you understand this, you'll never misread her signals again. Now, before you assume this is just another video telling you to chase harder or try some clever line, I want you to pause for a moment. Take a breath with me because what we're about to talk about isn't about manipulation. It's not about games. It's about understanding human psychology at a deeper level, especially the emotional layers women don't always reveal on the surface. And I want to speak directly to you for a second. If you're here, there's probably someone specific on your mind. Someone whose mixed signals have kept you up at night. Someone who seemed warm one week and distant the next. You've replayed conversations in your head. You've analyzed texts. You've wondered if you imagined the connection. And maybe part of you feels foolish for still thinking about her. You're not foolish. You're confused. And confusion happens when behavior and emotion don't line up in obvious ways, especially with women. So let's talk about the biggest mistake you might be making right now. You're assuming that distance equals disinterest, that silence equals indifference, that if she cared, she would show it clearly. That logic makes sense from a male psychology perspective. When men are interested, they tend to move closer. They initiate, they pursue. Their attraction is often action-oriented, but female attraction is layered with emotional risk assessment. Picture this, she takes hours to text back. When you run into her, she seems casual, almost too casual. She doesn't initiate conversations anymore. And when you're together, she acts like you're just another person in her day. You start questioning everything. Maybe I read this wrong. Maybe she was never interested. Maybe I should just move on. But here's what could actually be happening. When a woman is deeply attracted to you, her brain can enter what psychologists describe as an approach-avoidance conflict. This concept comes from classic motivational psychology research. It describes a situation where someone is drawn to something and simultaneously afraid of it. Attraction creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates risk, and risk activates defense mechanisms. If she feels strongly about you, especially if she's been hurt before, her nervous system may interpret that attraction as a potential threat, not because you are dangerous, but because emotional exposure is. So instead of moving closer, she pulls back. Instead of expressing interest clearly, she moderates it. Instead of leaning in, she observes. This can show up as hot and cold behavior. It can show up as delayed responses. It can show up as emotional distance that feels confusing and even hurtful. But here's the deeper truth. Let's look at the signals that reveal what's really going on. The more she's thinking about you, the more she may try to regulate how much you see of that. Overthinking is often a sign of deep emotional investment. When someone occupies mental space, the brain replays interactions. I'm Sarah Johnson, host of The Female Touch. We explore the psychological truths of attraction that most people overlook. Where are you watching from? If this topic resonates with you, gently tap the like button. I read all your comments. It analyzes tone. It imagines future scenarios. It anticipates outcomes. And anticipation builds emotional intensity. Now, let me be clear. Not every woman who pulls back is secretly obsessed. Sometimes distance is simply distance. Sometimes disinterest is exactly what it looks like. But when certain patterns appear consistently, they tell a different story. And this is where most men miss it. They interpret protective behavior as rejection. They withdraw just as her world lights up. Now, let's talk about the first sign. She watches you when she thinks you're not looking. This is subtle but powerful. In social psychology, attention is one of the clearest indicators of cognitive preoccupation. Where attention goes, mental energy follows. If she frequently observes you in group settings, noticing how you carry yourself and how others respond, it's rarely neutral. I once worked with a client who swore she had no feelings for a man. Yet, she could recount exactly what he wore and how his tone shifted. That level of detail does not come from indifference. Often it's self-regulation. The brain saying, careful, don't be obvious. In the digital world, she views your stories quickly. She may scroll through older photos or resurface with a comment on an old post. That is attention. And attention repeated over time is investment. Instead of asking if she's texting enough, ask, is she tracking me? Is she aware of changes in your routine? Does she reference things she observed? Does she bring up topics connected to your interests? When someone's mind is orbiting you, patterns form. Sign 2. She remembers small details you mentioned weeks ago. Human memory is selective. Emotionally relevant information is encoded more deeply. The brain prioritizes what matters. If you mentioned a presentation and 2 weeks later she asks how it went, that's not random kindness. That's mental storage. If she remembers you don't like olives or your sister's name, it means she replayed those conversations internally. We remember what we rehearse, and we rehearse what holds emotional weight. This is where many men underestimate attachment. They assume consistency must look like constant communication, but often attachment looks like silent processing. She may not flood your phone with messages, but she's building a mental file on you. And here's something that might surprise you. She may not consciously realize she's doing it. The subconscious mind filters thousands of stimuli daily. When someone consistently stands out, that means your presence is tagged as significant. Now, I want you to think about someone you genuinely didn't care about. Could you recall specific details about their preferences weeks later? Probably not. That contrast tells you everything, and we're just getting started. Because sign number 3 changes the entire dynamic, and when you notice it, you'll understand just how deeply you've entered her inner world. Now let's go deeper. Sign number 3 is one of the most reliable indicators that you are not just a passing thought in her mind. Her friends know about you, and not just in a vague way. They know details. If you've ever walked into a room and felt a subtle shift when her friends noticed you, pay attention to that. If they exchange looks, if they smile in a knowing way, if one of them says, "Oh, so you're the one," and then quickly changes the subject, that's not random. Women process attraction verbally. Numerous studies on social bonding show that women tend to strengthen emotional clarity through conversation. They talk through feelings, they analyze interactions, they replay texts in group chats. They ask, "What do you think he meant by that?" If her friends recognize your name, your job, or your story, and you've barely interacted with them, that means you've been a topic of discussion. You've occupied space not just in her thoughts, but in her social circle. And here's something important. When a woman repeatedly talks about a man to her friends, she's not neutral. She's trying to understand her own feelings. She's seeking emotional validation. I once counseled a woman in her early 50s who kept insisting she wasn't interested in a man she met through mutual friends. Yet, she brought him up in nearly every session. She analyzed his tone, his pauses, his jokes, his reactions. Eventually, I asked her gently, "If you truly didn't care, why is he living in your head, Rentré?" She laughed. Then she cried because attraction, especially later in life when you've been hurt before, feels risky. And risk makes intelligent people cautious. If her friends are slightly protective around you, or curious or evaluating you with subtle intensity, it's often because they've heard about you enough to feel invested. That doesn't mean she's planning your wedding, but it does mean you're not insignificant. Now let's talk about the sign that confuses men the most. Sign number 4, she initiates contact randomly, then disappears again. This is where so many men panic. She sends a message out of nowhere, a meme, a question. This reminded me of you. Something light, something that seems almost casual. You respond. The conversation flows. There's warmth. There's chemistry. You think, okay, this is it. We're moving forward. And then silence. Hours turn into days. Days turn into a week. You feel the emotional drop. What did I say? Did I mess this up? Was she bored? Let me explain what might actually be happening. In psychology, approach-avoidance conflict describes a situation where someone desires closeness, but simultaneously fears the consequences of that closeness. When she's been thinking about you intensely, the urge to connect builds pressure. That pressure eventually pushes her to reach out. But the moment she does and feels the emotional intensity rise, fear can activate. She reaches out right when enough time has passed that she worries you might detach. That means she's tracking emotional distance. If she didn't care, she wouldn't calculate silence. She wouldn't feel the need to reestablish connection. She would simply move on. But she doesn't. And this is where your reaction becomes critical. Many men fail this moment by becoming reactive. They either over-pursue or emotionally withdraw in frustration. They demand clarity. They send long paragraphs, or they mirror coldness. But the man who remains grounded, calm, consistent, that's the man who passes the unconscious test. Because yes, this is often a test. Not a cruel one, not a conscious strategy, but an assessment. Is he emotionally stable? Is he secure? Does he crumble under ambiguity? Women are biologically wired to seek emotional safety, especially after 50, after heartbreak, after divorce, after betrayal. Stability becomes attractive in a way intensity never could. And that brings us to sign number 5. She behaves slightly differently around you than she does with others. Watch her energy carefully. With most people, she's relaxed, neutral, predictable. With you, something shifts. Maybe she becomes quieter. Maybe she laughs more. Maybe her voice changes pitch. Maybe she fidgets with her jewelry. Maybe she touches her hair. Maybe she avoids eye contact, then looks back when you're not looking. These are nervous system responses. Attraction activates physiological arousal. Heart rate increases slightly. Cortisol can rise. Awareness sharpens. When someone genuinely doesn't care about you, their body is neutral. When someone is affected by you, their body reveals it before their words ever will. And here's something powerful. If she becomes slightly more guarded around you, that can be an even stronger sign than flirtation. Guarded behavior often means you matter enough to impact me. People don't build emotional walls around people who are irrelevant. Now, I want you to reflect on something. Have you noticed her posture change when you enter a room? Have you felt a subtle tension? Have you seen her act composed, but almost overly composed? That overcomposure is often containment. She's managing emotion, and emotional management requires emotional investment. Now let's talk about sign number 6. She tests you. Most men fail this without realizing it. She may casually mention another man to see how you react. She may cancel plans last minute to observe your emotional response. She may go slightly cold to measure your stability. These aren't childish games in most mature women. They're subconscious evaluations. Does he get jealous easily? Does he lose his composure? Does he chase desperately? Does he withdraw angrily? When a woman feels something real, especially later in life, she wants to know the foundation is solid. She's not just asking, do I like him? She's asking, is he emotionally safe? This is especially true for women who have experienced betrayal or emotional neglect in past relationships. And this is where you have power. Not power over her, power over yourself. The man who can remain steady during ambiguity signals strength without aggression. He doesn't need to dominate. He doesn't need to beg. He doesn't need to prove. He simply stays grounded. And that grounded energy reduces her fear, which brings us to sign number 7. And this one reveals exactly what you should do next. But before we go there, I want you to pause. If you're starting to see patterns clearly now, comment the word aware below. That word means you're no longer reacting blindly. You're observing intelligently because awareness changes everything. Now let's talk about what sign number 7 means for you and how to respond in a way that transforms confusion into connection. Now we come to sign number 7, and this is the one that changes everything. She mirrors you emotionally, but only after you pull back. This is subtle, powerful, and incredibly revealing. Here's how it works. When you lean in too hard, she creates space. When you overext, she slows down. When you chase, she retreats. But when you ground yourself, when you stop over-explaining, when you focus on your own life, something shifts. Suddenly she leans in, she initiates, she asks questions, she references future plans, she increases warmth. This is not coincidence, it's polarity. When a woman feels emotionally overwhelmed by attraction, she instinctively restores balance by pulling away. But when she senses she might actually lose you, not through manipulation, but through your genuine emotional stability, her attachment system activates. In attachment psychology, this dynamic often shows up in what's called anxious avoidant interplay. If she has even mild avoidant tendencies, intense closeness can trigger her independence reflex. But emotional absence, when calm and self-assured, can activate her longing. The key difference is this. If she doesn't care, your emotional withdrawal won't matter. If she is invested, your emotional shift will register immediately. I've seen this countless times in real life. A gentleman in his early 60s once told me he felt foolish for stepping back from a woman who kept sending mixed signals. He stopped initiating for a week, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. He focused on his hobbies, his friends, his exercise routine. 3 days later, she reached out with, "I feel like I haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" That question was not about logistics. It was about emotional connection. Now, listen carefully because this is important. This is not about playing games. This is about energetic alignment. When you detach from outcome, when you stop trying to force clarity, you create emotional space, and space reveals truth. If she fills that space, she cares. If she doesn't, she doesn't. But here's what most men struggle with. They want certainty immediately. They want her to say, "I like you." They want consistency from day one. But attraction, especially in emotionally guarded women, unfolds in layers. And here's something I want you to really sit with. The man who can tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into anxiety, that is the man who feels safe. And safety is magnetic. Let me explain why. When a woman senses that her emotional fluctuations don't destabilize you, she relaxes. She doesn't feel pressured. She doesn't feel chased. She doesn't feel cornered. She feels room. And room allows desire to grow naturally. Now, I want to give you something practical because understanding signs is only half of this. You need to know what to do. First, regulate your own nervous system. If she goes quiet, do not catastrophize. Don't spiral into "it's over." Don't send paragraphs seeking reassurance. Instead, pause. Take a walk. Go to the gym. Call a friend. Redirect your focus to your own life. This communicates strength without words. Second, respond. Don't react. If she reaches out after distance, don't punish her with coldness, but don't reward inconsistency with overexcitement either. Stay warm, measured, calm. Think of it like emotional jazz, responsive but not frantic. Third, build a life that genuinely fulfills you outside of her. This isn't strategy, it's sanity. When your identity isn't dependent on her validation, you naturally become more attractive. Not because you're pretending not to care, but because you don't need constant reassurance. And here's something that might challenge you. Sometimes the reason you're confused isn't because she's unclear. It's because you're overinvested too early. When you place someone on a pedestal before emotional consistency is established, you amplify every signal. A delayed text feels devastating. A neutral tone feels rejecting. A canceled plan feels catastrophic, but when you move at a grounded pace, signals become data, not emotional emergencies. Now, let's address something honestly. Not every woman who shows these signs is obsessed. Sometimes she's simply curious. Sometimes she's uncertain. Sometimes she's exploring her own emotions. But obsession in this context doesn't mean unhealthy fixation. It means cognitive preoccupation. You cross her mind repeatedly. You affect her mood. You influence her behavior, and that matters. However, here's the part nobody tells you. If you become obsessed with whether she's obsessed, you reverse the polarity. Attraction thrives in emotional balance. When both people feel they have something to lose, but not everything, tension builds in a healthy way. When one person clings and the other regulates, imbalance forms. So, what's the deeper takeaway here? It's not about decoding her every move. It's about becoming the man who doesn't need to decode endlessly. When you are secure, emotionally centered, and purposeful, you don't panic at mixed signals. You observe, you assess, you respond with dignity. And here's the irony. The moment you stop needing proof of her obsession, that's when her feelings often intensify because neediness repels. Calm confidence attracts. Let me ask you something gently. If she never gave you total certainty, would you still value yourself? That question matters more than all 7 signs combined, because your self-worth must not hang on her clarity. Now, if this conversation is shifting something inside you, I want you to take one small action. Subscribe, not just for content, but because we are building a community of emotionally intelligent men who want understanding, not manipulation, depth, not drama. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to explain something even deeper, why the very thing you think is pushing her away might actually be accelerating her attachment. But you have to handle it correctly. Now, let's bring this all together because the truth is understanding her psychology means nothing if you don't understand your own. The very thing you think is pushing her away might actually be accelerating her attachment. And that thing is your emotional independence. Let me explain this carefully. When a woman feels drawn to you but senses that you are emotionally self-sufficient, something powerful happens in her subconscious. Her brain categorizes you as stable, secure, grounded, and grounded men are rare, especially in a world where emotional reactivity has become normal. When she pulls back and you don't panic, you communicate strength. When she tests and you don't crumble, you communicate maturity. When she disappears briefly and you don't send paragraphs demanding clarity, you communicate emotional leadership. And emotional leadership is deeply attractive. Not dominance, not control. Leadership. The ability to regulate yourself so she doesn't have to regulate you. Here's where this gets profound. When you over-pursue, you relieve her of uncertainty, you remove the tension, you make yourself predictable. And while predictability feels safe, it can sometimes reduce the psychological space where desire grows. But when you stay consistent without chasing, you create something far more compelling. emotional intrigue. She begins to wonder, what is he thinking? Why isn't he reacting? Is he losing interest? Does he have options? That wondering keeps you in her cognitive loop. And remember, cognitive loop equals mental presence. Now let me tell you a story. A gentleman I once coached had been dating a woman for several months. She was warm, affectionate, engaged, and then suddenly distant. He panicked. He almost sent a long message asking where he stood. Instead, he did something different. He stayed steady. He responded when she reached out, but he didn't chase. He continued living his life. He posted photos from a hiking trip. He met friends. He remained kind, but not over-available. 2 weeks later, she invited him to dinner and confessed something surprising. I don't know why, but when you didn't react to my distance, it made me realize how much I care about you. What changed? Not her, him. His stability forced her to confront her own feelings, and this is the paradox. When you stop trying to force emotional clarity, clarity often reveals itself. But here's the caution. This only works if it's genuine. If you pretend to be detached while obsessing internally, she will feel the incongruence. Women are highly intuitive when it comes to emotional energy, so your real work is internal. Let's talk about practical integration. First, practice delayed reaction. If she sends something that triggers you, jealousy, insecurity, confusion, wait. Do not respond immediately. Give yourself time to regulate. Even 30 minutes can shift your emotional tone. Second, strengthen your identity outside of romantic pursuit. What are your passions, your friendships, your routines, your physical health habits? Attraction deepens when she sees that she is a part of your life, not the center of it. Third, stop overanalyzing every micro signal. Patterns matter. Isolated incidents do not. If she consistently returns, consistently remembers details, consistently watches you, consistently mirrors your emotional shifts, that's investment. If she rarely engages and never initiates, that's data too. The goal isn't to convince yourself she's obsessed. The goal is to read reality calmly. And here's something I want you to hear clearly. Even if she is thinking about you constantly, even if she is pulling back out of fear, even if all 7 signs are present, you still must choose yourself first, because obsession without action is not partnership. At some point, her internal struggle must transform into consistent behavior, and you deserve consistency. Understanding her psychology is powerful, but honoring your value is essential. Let me ask you something quietly. If she never became clear, would you still respect how you handled yourself? Would you be proud of your composure, your patience, your strength? Because that's the real win. Not whether she's obsessed, but whether you remained grounded. And here's the final insight. When a woman is truly thinking about you constantly, the tension becomes too strong to ignore forever. Curiosity turns into initiative. Fear turns into vulnerability. Distance eventually collapses into closeness if the emotional safety is there. Your job is not to chase that moment. Your job is to be ready for it. Be the man who can sit in uncertainty without crumbling. Be the man who doesn't beg for reassurance. Be the man who observes more than he reacts. Be the man who walks away if clarity never comes, because paradoxically, the ability to walk away calmly is what makes staying so powerful. Now, I want you to do something simple. If this conversation opened your eyes to patterns you've been missing, comment the word aware below. If you recognize someone specific while listening, that awareness is your first step toward emotional intelligence. And if you're ready to go deeper, not into games, not into tricks, but into real psychological understanding of attraction, hit subscribe, because in the next video, we're going to explore exactly how to turn her silent curiosity into confident action without manipulation, without pressure, and without losing your dignity. Remember this, cold does not always mean careless. Distance does not always mean disinterest. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means she feels more than she's ready to show. The question is not whether she's obsessed.